Macbeth, Act 1, Scene 1. The stage directions at the beginning of this act, depending on what edition you've got, might say slightly different things. Some will say that it's set in a desert place, meaning a deserted place, an isolated place. Some will specify that it's on the heath, and some will specify that it's a battlefield. Either way, it doesn't really matter. Whether it says heath, desert place or battlefield, the key thing to bear in mind about the significance of this stage direction is that the witches, because we're told just a little further along that line that 3 witches enter, more about them in a minute, the key thing is that the location in which these witches meet, or weird sisters, it is completely away from civilization. It is isolated, it is cut off. This is very deliberate because Shakespeare is showing us that the forces of the supernatural, the witches, the weird sisters, meet in places away from civilization. They are not part of civilization. They are very different and apart, set apart from civilization, which is why they meet in a desert place, a deserted place, or on a heath, or on the battlefield, depending on which edition you've got. We're then told in the stage direction that there is thunder and lightning. This is also significant because the thunder and lightning is symbolic of turmoil and chaos, and having these weather conditions at the start of the play, Shakespeare is foreshadowing, foreboding the chaos and the turbulence that's going to come later on in the play. Then we are told, enter 3 witches. It is actually significant that there are 3 witches rather than 2 or 4, because in the occult, in the supernatural, numbers such as 3, 6 and 9 are particularly important for the supernatural or the occult rituals. Now, one thing to bear in mind before we even start looking at the wording of the act itself, what the witches actually say, is that Shakespeare's original audience would have taken witchcraft very seriously. James I was on the throne at the time that Shakespeare was writing and then having this play performed. And James I was particularly interested in witchcraft, particularly interested in getting rid of it and stamping it out. So Shakespeare's audience, although they knew they were watching a play, a piece of drama, they would have taken the characterization of the witches very seriously, whereas in our less superstitious times we don't take them quite so seriously as Shakespeare's audience would have done. The first witch, unsurprisingly, is the first witch to speak first. When shall we 3 meet again? In thunder, lightning, or in rain? She specifies that there are 3 of them, again for the reasons that I've already outlined, and notice that in the same way that the witches enjoy meeting in out-of-the-way places away from civilization, they are planning to meet in unpleasant weather, the thunder, the lightning and the rain that are again associated with these agents of evil, these agents of the supernatural. And remember that the presence of the thunder and lightning in particular is that foreboding, that foreshadowing of the chaos to come. The second witch replies, when the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won. Hurly-burly is another word for chaos, for turmoil. So she's saying that they will meet again when the hurly-burly's done, when the chaos and the turmoil of the battle, that's specifically what she's referring to here, is over, done. Now, the second witch is the first witch in the play to speak in what we call a paradox. Now, a paradox is where you have a phrase that seems to contradict itself. It is contradictory. When the battle's lost and won. But the thing is about this paradox is that it does actually contain some wisdom. It actually contains some sense. Now, Shakespeare's audience would have understood that witches spoke in riddles, They told lies. They would have spoken in paradoxes like this. But what's quite disturbing, deliberately so, about what the second witch says is that this paradox, this seeming contradiction when the battle's lost and won, actually contains a degree of sense and wisdom. Because when you think about it, a battle can be both lost and won. One side loses and the other side wins. When you first hear it, when the battle's lost and won, you do think to yourself, well, how can that be? That doesn't make sense. But thinking about it, well, you don't even have to think about it that deeply, really. A battle can be both lost and won. One side loses and the other side wins. So, essentially, what we're being told in these first two lines is that the witches are planning to meet again once the battle is over. The third witch then says, "That will be ere the set of sun." Ere, E-R-E, is just an archaic way of saying before. So the third witch is saying here that the three witches will meet again just before the sun sets. And as you can see, this is at a time of day when it's just about to go dark, and you would associate the forces of the supernatural, the witches, with darkness. So they're planning to meet just before it gets dark. "Where the place?" the first witch asks. "Upon the heath," is the reply from the second witch. So remember, this heath that they're referring to is going to be away from civilization. It's going to be away from where ordinary human beings live, because the witches are not ordinary, and they're certainly not meant to be seen as human. So they're going to meet upon the heath. Then comes a key line. The third witch reveals, "There to meet with Macbeth." This automatically is going to put a suspicion in the minds of the audience about the character of Macbeth. Imagine that you are a first-time audience member going to see this play for the first time. You know it's called Macbeth because you've seen it on the posters. And usually you expect a play which is named after its key character, that the key character is going to be a hero, a good person. And yet, the very first character to mention Macbeth's name is a witch. It puts a doubt into the audience's mind. Why do they want to meet with Macbeth? Why do the forces of darkness, these agents of evil, these devil's disciples, which is how people would have viewed witches in Shakespeare's time, why do they want to meet with Macbeth? So straight away, in the very first act, in the very first scene, it's put into the audience's mind, these seeds of doubt are sown into the audience's mind that maybe there is something about Macbeth that we need to be wary of. If the forces of darkness want to speak to him, that raises suspicions about his character. The witches have made their arrangement by this time. The first witch then says, "I come, Grey Malkin." The second witch replies, "Paddock calls." And then the third witch says, "Anon." What's that all about? Well, Grey Malkin and Paddock are both examples of what we call witches' familiars. If you think about the stereotypical image of a witch, you've got the ugly old woman with the pointy hat on the broomstick with a black cat. Now, Grey Malkin is an example of what we call a witch's familiar, which is a cat. Now, a witch's familiar was supposed to be a spirit or demon in the form of an animal. It's one of the reasons why the stereotypical image of the witch is so often pictured with a cat. it's an example of a companion which is actually the devil, or not the devil rather, but a demon or some sort of evil spirit in the form of an animal. The cat is the most obvious one and the one that we are most familiar with, and that's what Grey Malkin is supposed to be. Paddock is another example of a witch's familiar, and a paddock is a toad. So clearly the first witch has got a familiar, an evil spirit with her in the form of a cat, and the second witch has got one in the form of a toad. When the third witch says anon, and you'll actually come across this word quite often in Shakespeare, anon is simply an archaic way of saying I'm coming or I'll be there in a minute. So we assume that the third witch has also heard the voice of her familiar calling to her across the heath, and she's replying that she's coming in a minute, she won't be long. Then all of the witches say together, and this brings this short scene to an end: fair is foul, and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air. Now remember, only a few lines ago, we had an example of a paradox, one of these phrases where you have a contradiction or a seeming contradiction. You also have an example of that here. Fair is foul and foul is fair seems, at first glance and on first hearing, another example of one of these paradoxes that does not appear to make sense. And yet actually it does. What the witches are saying here is that to them, fair is foul. Good things to them are bad. They find anything good bad. They are not like ordinary people. Well, strictly speaking, they're not people at all. They are these agents of the devil. And to them, anything fair is foul. Whereas in their way of doing things, foul, evil, is fair. Evil is good. They find it good to do evil. Hence the reason that they come up with this mantra, if you like: fair is foul and foul is fair. Then, as they make their exit from the stage, or their exit from the heath, we are told that they are going to hover through the fog and filthy air. Hover is deliberately there to show that the witches don't move like normal people. If they want to, the witches have the power to hover, to fly through the air. Shakespeare's audience, remember, took witchcraft very seriously, and one of the things that it was believed that witches did was that they created fog in order that they could move in areas where people were living, populated areas, without being noticed, without being seen. So Shakespeare's audience genuinely believed that if there was a fog, it meant a witch or witches were moving through your town or your village, and the fog was there to obscure what you were doing. Also in Shakespeare's time, and remember, when I say Shakespeare's time, we're talking about the late 16th and the early 17th centuries, people believed that diseases, and they didn't have a very good understanding of diseases, not like we do today. They thought that diseases were caused by bad air, and fog in particular was meant to be very bad. Diseases and so on were transmitted through fog, and of course witches created fog, and so therefore witches were often responsible for pestilence and diseases and things like that. So that's why Shakespeare gets this image of the witches hovering through the air, creating this fog so that nobody can see them moving, and this fog is going to be filthy, it's going to be full of disease, and it will transmit that disease when they pass through towns and villages. So Act 1, Scene 1 begins the play on really quite a dark tone, a dark and supernatural tone. These witches, these weird sisters, are planning to meet with Macbeth in an isolated spot. At the moment, we don't know why they want to meet with him, but if you think back to the very first tutorial that I did with you when we looked at tragedy, Remember that these witches are going to influence, they're going to strongly influence some of the decisions that Macbeth is going to take as he begins his downfall from this position of greatness to this position of disgrace at the end of the play. So, next stop, Act 1, Scene 2.